How are you?
I'm doing great. We're talking a very exciting day. We have OpenAI about to make an announcement. I thought I'd start by just asking to for you to broadly reflect on sort of the OpenAI versus Anthropic. What's happening here? How do you make sense of the ecosystem?
Yeah, so just, obviously disclosure, my wife's at OpenAI. She's one of the first people there, so I have a bit of a bias. Um, I have a bias against Anthropic as well. So, I have this kind of like dual bias. Um, but basically just trying to be objective. If you monetized ChatGPT, both enterprise and consumer fully, you'd actually have, I think, quite a lot more revenue than today. So just case in point, my financial software company, we have about 10 licenses to Anthropic, and it's supposed to be $20 a seat. We get a bill for $1,000, and or like $1,500, and that's it's good, 5 to 7x kind of what we ask for. And OpenAI can do that to their customers too. Their customers will pay it. They don't really care. It's a bargain either way. But if you try to wring every dollar out of your user, that has some adverse consequences, I think. And OpenAI, I think, has figured this out and wants to sort of boost their ASP or whatever dollars per seat. And so they're working their way upstream. But I think the traditional VC, entrepreneur advice would be don't, rinse your customer if you can't help it. And I think that, for Anthropic, for whatever reason, they want to price through the roof with all these overages. I mean, people complain that two prompts eats up their entire allotted, amount. And so I think if OpenAI did that, they probably could get their today's enterprise revenue to something like 100 billion. I know some people would be very surprised to hear that, but I think that's the case. And then on consumer, the same thing with ads, right? So they might have, and again, this sounds preposterous to anybody listening, but if they were steady, if they did the same monetization effort as Anthropic, their real revenue right now would be about 200 versus their 30. So I think this idea that Anthropic's taking the lead or something like that, I mean, it's pretty far fetched. Now, having said that, obviously we're super impressive product, really great people that work there. I think Dario is he's not my favorite guy. Obviously incredible entrepreneur, beautiful business he's made, but the whole like he tried to scare the world by saying AI is going to kill you, it's going to take over the world. Nobody really believed that. It's nonsense. And he says, well, let me shrink that down a little bit to, oh, the AI is going to hack you, and everyone's like, oh, well, it could happen, And so it's kind of the greatest marketing trick, but it's I don't think it's in great faith. And I do think to some extent these guys are true believers of the Doomer hypothesis, and so it's hard to tell what's real and what isn't. It's just conveniently also good marketing.
I was really confused by the Anthropic DOW incident, about a month ago now, why there was so much support for Anthropic on this. To me, it felt as obvious as like a bullet maker saying, hey, we're only going to sell you these bullets, but only if we can, help influence how you use them, separate from U.S. law. Now, I know I'm definitely simplifying it, and I'm sure we'll get some defenders to come on the show at some point. But to me, it kind of felt obvious that they we should sort of leave things to private companies shouldn't be dictating foreign policy. I get their concerns about domestic surveillance, but we have laws for that to protect us from that from government overreach, and it just doesn't seem like the realm of private companies to get into. What am I missing there?
No, I don't think you ever say anything. I mean, I think that the idea that there would be some super governmental, authority is a little scary. I used to, back in the hedge fund days, when the markets were shaky around 2008, I would ask some hedge fund friends, would you rather buy bonds in Johnson and Johnson or bonds in the U.S. government? And it's a very interesting question because in some ways at the time it seemed like the U.S. Could default, it could the financial markets could collapse. Johnson and Johnson's not going to collapse. Anywhere in the world where there's consumer healthcare, pharmaceutical, and med tech, they did all three. Every part of healthcare, every country in the world buys Johnson and Johnson. Dollar could go worthless. J&J will survive. United States of America would not, at least financially. Now, obviously, the U.S. is very, is extremely resilient. It's the greatest country on earth, et cetera. But at the time, there was a question as to whether bond yields would be better for a high quality corporate versus a sovereign. And certainly, if you look at some sovereigns like Brazil, J&J bonds do yield less than Brazilian bonds. They're riskier. They're more likely to default than J&J. And part of that comes from this, like, again, super governmental. Like J&J in a sense is its own country. It has employees. It has couple hundred thousand people. It's got a lot of revenue. It's bigger than the country I come from, called Albania. So in a lot of ways, you know, Anthropic in some ways is sort of gonna be its own entity, and this is sort of a nation, sort of network state kind of thinking, corporate state in some ways, and with all that revenue and all that power that comes from having a powerful piece of software, I could see that sort of getting to somebody like Dario's head of thinking about, oh my gosh, with great responsibility comes great power, and it's sort of like obviously way overwrought. Whereas people I think at OpenAI and other companies, even Google, are just sort of like, yeah, it's just software, man. Our job's to sell it. It's not that big of a deal. Meanwhile, he's like, I am Spider-Man.
Yeah.
I must be Batman. He wants to be a superhero, and it's like, obviously he's selling software really well, but
Totally.
I think the theatrics are kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. Us get into other parts of the ecosystem. Are you still a huge NVIDIA bull? I don't know if you saw the Jensen versus Dorkesh, but yeah, what's your latest thinking on NVIDIA?
Yeah, I said that NVIDIA would be the first $10 trillion market cap. I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm starting a sort of a hardware startup. Um, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry. So I was shorting these stocks, quantum computing stocks, and I had to learn computing. And so I learned a lot about computer science. I learned a lot about hardware, and I was very convinced that the quantum computing story is basically fraud. Like I literally think some of their CEOs of the quantum computing companies will go to jail.
Wow.
It's so bad. Um, Quantum computing is really useful for one algorithm, Shor's algorithm. So unless you're a code breaker, and I don't know of any corporate code breakers, there aren't really too many avenues there. So I started thinking about frontier computing in general, and I stumbled upon photonic computing, and now I have a startup in this space. Interestingly, we're already a publicly traded company, but that's sort of your configuration kind of doesn't matter much, whether public, private, or even non-for-profit. So I think photonic computing is really exciting. It's not going to challenge NVIDIA anytime soon, but I think that what I've learned trying to program some AI, a couple pivots ago, before we settled in on financial software, I learned that if you do the flame trace or the Perfetto of a really zoomed in, like nanosecond level instructions, basically all the GPU is doing is matmls, so-called generalized matmul on the NVIDIA hardware, and Light does matmls for free. So you have a matmul machine in Light. God kind of made Light to do matmls whenever it diffracts. So you get the speed of light matmul. And if we had an optical computer, I think it would have like 1,000x to 1,000,000x performance, depending on whether it's speed or speed and energy included. And so flops per watt or something like that, flops per joule. So I think there's like I think eventually, Moore's law, Jensen's already said it's dead. I think everyone's seen that, but you know, I don't think processor speed's going to really improve at all. And I think just shoving more energy through the system, making bigger systems, these are like the only things we can do. We need to do something. I don't want to have data centers in space. I don't want to have nuclear reactors in my backyard. And I think that, it'd be a lot easier if we just made a freaking better computer. And I think that's what's going to happen. So there's Neurophos. They raised 150. There's a company called Flux Computing that renamed to Olix. They raised 250. We're out there. There's a couple of little smaller guys too. And I think that one of us, hopefully all of us in some ways, will, and there's obviously unconventional, which has it's a little opaque exactly what it's doing, but, very highly funded effort. They raised $1 billion, I think. And, I think it's time for a new computer. And ultimately, we're working on the hard parts of this. So that it sounds great, but there's a bunch of catches. And one of the catches is nonlinearity is very hard to do in optical computing. We think we figured out a way to do it. The other catch is there's no memory in optics. So we think we figured out a way to do that. So I think that we're going to see a lot of like bankruptcies. We're going to see a lot of startups in this space. But I think it's sort of time for the end of silicon and the end of maybe not the end of silicon, maybe the end of transistors. And whoever is going to sort of do that. I mean, the number one company in the world is NVIDIA. And so there's $10 trillion, whether you include all the other hardware coming out, the rest of the ecosystem, et cetera, maybe it's $5 to $10 trillion market cap up for grabs. And it's not an area where there's a lot of startups, which is like really shocking. Like the amount of agent startups is in the thousands and thousands. I can name every single optical computing company on my hand. And compared to biological computing or quantum or some of the other alternative computings, those aren't really that exciting. So Photonic is, many people I've talked to at OpenAI or Meta and other places, they sort of all agree inevitably Photonics is going to be here. And I feel like, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years, it's still worth making that computer because you need to hand the baton off. I don't think NVIDIA is going to stay asleep, but I also don't think that, this is necessarily an easy thing to sort of embark on. Most of the time, these bigger companies will resist kind of uprooting themselves.
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say you did this epically hilarious debate with somebody on quantum that we'll link to, and he was a bull, and you got into the technology, and he couldn't really, he couldn't really defend himself there. Although I'm sure he's a nice guy,
Yeah,
but
very nice guy.
yeah. But it just goes to show that this is very complex stuff, and
Well,
if you're
quantum sounds futuristic, right? It's a
yeah
quantum that sounds really cool. Like,
yeah
well, it's not that cool if you understand that computers basically be measured in sort of two ways. You have the number of threads, number of operations at a time, kind of parallelization, which is why NVIDIA is so cool, 16,000 threads versus your average computer's, 16 threads. And then, it's 1,000x, literally 1,000x more threads. And then you have clock speed, and you have basically multiply the two. And clock speed's, in the gigahertz for, both those computers. So you have 1,000x speed up with NVIDIA if you can parallelize the instructions. The quantum, the fastest quantum computer I'm aware of is a megahertz, which is your calculator's faster than that, and it's literally 1,000 times slower than a normal computer. It's single threaded, and the only way the tortoise beats the hare is when you have an algorithmic advantage. And the algorithmic advantage exists, in Shores, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. And what's interesting is you have these market caps. A quantum is about in aggregate about 100 billion. And so, obviously Naveen's company, my company, the other couple of companies I mentioned, why don't we have a market cap of aggregate 100 billion? Why not? In fact, because it's actually useful. The world, nobody wants to do integer factorization. Everyone wants to do matmul's. Why don't we have a market cap of 500 billion? And I think we will. And so that's kind of the pitch there. And I know, your company, is I think one of the major investors in this new thing, in Naveen's company, amongst many others, all-star list of investors. And I don't know what they're doing at all, but I understand that the race to make the next computer is on, and some people are sort of half-stepping it. Like there's some great companies doing ASICs, which is fantastic. TPUs even are sort of half steps. You're still in transistors, and you're still limited by kind of the problems that come with scaling transistors, which are well known, and we'll eke out just a little bit more performance out of that. But I think to get 1,000x improvement, you need to do something pretty different.
Is there a particular milestone where you will know you're being successful or onto the right thing, or how are you don't share anything confidential, but how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I think you have to, we talk about this internally because taping something out is sort of to some extent, it's a waste of time. Unlike electronics, you can actually set up these experiments in free space. So that's the nice thing about light is like a light lab, an optics photonics lab is pretty easy to set up. I'd say that unless you get 1,000x or at bare minimum 100x improvement, it's not even worth taping out. Our rivals are using SRAM and some other, analog electronics. I think you have to stay in all optics. Never the conversion kills you if you go from electric to optical, back to electric, back to optical. I mean, you might as well not make the chip, in my opinion. But folks want to try it anyway. They want to do their best Grok imitation, and Grok, is obviously great success from an investor standpoint. And so, I think you stay in optics. If you can make a whole LLM in optics, then you tape it out, and you hopefully get the performance characteristics we're talking about. But actually, what's interesting about it is, your question kind of is revealing because what's not well known about this is that guys have been doing this in academics for many years now. So UT Austin showed a optical transformer. Guy at UCLA showed optical nonlinearity. We're very recently. So work has been done on this that's pretty impressive. It's not like biological computing. We're still trying to get like the machine to add two numbers. We don't know how we're going to do it. The soup of neurons might magically start thinking. Um, Optical computing is sort of here. It's just, a matter of scaling it, some of the other challenges I mentioned. So I think if you can get, some of these tricks down, we're actually closer than we think. But I still think, you got to be realistic. No matter how much of an optimism you need as an entrepreneur, you have to be a little bit realistic that you're not going to kill NVIDIA overnight, and you're not even going to kill 5% of it. It's fun. Like look at Grok. Grok took this like very small, ultra fast segment of the market. They didn't take it all, but for people that really need like very low latency, Grok's a decent solution, and that's a $20 billion win, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think you might carve a niche out that optics is really good, say for video, because video and optics kind of they're naturally the same thing. So maybe you do that or something like that, and I think that you'll sort of see it. You'll know it when you see it, and I think that the key is, in my opinion, is investor mismatch. So the problem, if you go to your investors and you say, "I'm going to have something 10x better than Nvidia next year," well, you better deliver that. And if you don't, if it comes out at like 5x or 3x, your investors will probably balk on another round because ultimately, Nvidia is not staying still, and your investors, your employees, everyone around you is just sort of gonna feel despondent that you're not getting anywhere. Google had the power to live through lots of crap with TPUs, right? Like they just didn't work, they didn't scale, and finally they got through every breakthrough. It took 15 years. So you need to make sure investors. I've talked to some people recently where I said I might need 20 years. Are you ready to sort of like live that through? For most people, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And so we're focused almost exclusively on corporates instead of VCs because I think that corporates sort of get that especially corporates that have been through it. They've been around for 40 years. They get that like it's worth it to stick around and wait. And look at NVIDIA. If NVIDIA had no revenue, this is a good thought experiment. Zero out all the revenue for NVIDIA of gaming, and look at the annual financials. What's the net present value of NVIDIA in back in 2020? It's actually the same as the net present value of it with or without gaming GPUs, because ultimately it was worth the wait for that gigantic hockey stick. So if you knew 25 years ago, in 20 years there's going to be a thing called AI, and we're going to dominate the hardware for that, you still should have invested. You still should have made it your no less of your biggest investment than as if they had the revenue and the GPUs. So I think that that this idea of really long termism. I almost want to think about it like a lab, the same, it's kind of the way OpenAI sort of thought about their business was we're gonna monetize something in AI. We don't know what it is. But, eventually it'll hit us and we'll know. This is a more directed effort, but I think that, there's something powerful about some investors now being willing to wait 10 years or wait 20 years. And the fact there's some entrepreneurs out there like SSI, they're willing to actually tell their investors, you're going to have to be really, really patient with this one. Don't expect cursor here.